Index investing or passive investing has grown more popular with investors. Even Warren Buffett touts the benefits of owning an entire index like the S&P 500 over the long term. An example of an index tracking ETF is BMO's S&P 500 Index ETF. It's the largest ETF in Canada that tracks this well-recognized and popular index. It provides exposure to the returns of the market cap weighted S&P 500 index at a low cost with a management fee of just 0.08%. This broad market ETF makes for an efficient building block in a portfolio, saving you time and effort while mitigating single stock risk. If you're looking for exposure to the largest and most liquid public companies in the United States, this ETF delivers an easy-to-use solution and instant diversification. Commissions and management fees and expenses all may be associated with investments in exchange-traded funds. Please read the ETF facts or prospectus of the BMO ETFs before investing.
Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that this information discussed today is not intended to be or construed as investment advice. Please consult a professional advisor before putting a loonie in any of these financial markets.
The dirty secret is that no one's ever going to get paid back.
People have the shortest memories when it comes to investment.
We just got to get Keith into Bitcoin.
Hey, there's a bubble. Welcome back to Loonie Hour, episode 119. As always, joined by the three amigos. Keith Dicker, IceCap Asset Management, new black shirt. Rich Diaz, PGM Global. What's going on? Rich?
Me? I'm sick. Womp, womp, womp. I'm a little under the weather, boys. That's
the
it.
sixth booster, buddy.
No, I got my 12th booster, and it just didn't work. But no, I'm fine. It's just I'm just being a baby. I'm just a little. Don't worry, you guys are gonna turn my frown upside down. I'm ready to go. Lots of fun stuff to talk about.
As always, Keith and I will carry the show.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So yeah, carry me over the finish line. And if I cough, everybody, I apologize. I'm actually taking these medicated Strepsils, which I brought for my mom. There was a point in my mother's life, I think she may have been addicted to Strepsils that I brought from England that are medicated. Don't tell her I said that. But anyways, they're amazing. I think they make my tongue numb. Anyway, there you go. That's the story.
This episode brought to you by Pfizer. Weren't people actually wearing masks on Zoom calls during the pandemic?
They were. Yeah, that was very stupid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Apologize
guys,
for
I never
coughing.
get to introduce the guest. So today I'm going to jump the gun and introduce our guest today. And this guy, he's very well known in the US and professional football circles and world. A rock star from University of Iowa. He actually founded his own university called the Tight End University. And he's leading the 49ers into the playoffs this week against the Green Bay Packers. So here he is, everyone. We have my George Kittle action figure here. So if you're listening, you can't see. I'm a bit older, but I still like the action figures. Rich, when I was a kid, I had the Star Wars action figures.
Oh, man.
Did you guys have those?
I know I'm too young.
You're too young.
You guys must
Steve?
have been bullied in school. Both of you.
Maybe I was the bully. Anyway, guys, this is a football weekend. Playoffs are starting, and
Don't give a prediction. Every time you make predictions, they lose.
Yeah, no, it's football. Anything can happen, but
yeah, like the Dallas Cowboys can lose.
Yeah, the deck is really stacked against Green Bay for this one. For the rest the 49ers had and everything. So you always try, like say you're managing a portfolio, looking at the economy and stuff. You try to identify where's the weakness, where are the strengths, and Green Bay is not that strong in the middle of the field. So we'll attack those linebackers, but Mrs. Icecap is ready. We'll have some good food going and drinks. Saturday night, 8 p.m. Eastern.
See you there.
See you there with George Kittle. Here we go.
George Kittle.
Yeah.
Well,
back to the regularly scheduled program. Is that next?
Yeah,
Steve, what's all that white stuff behind you?
Yeah, we got a foot of snow in Vancouver, and the cold snap is gripping the West here. It's been cold. It's been cold in Alberta. Calgary was down to like -40, -45. I actually had like an appliance delivery to like one of my rental properties, and they're like, "Oh, we got to come back. Like, we can't fit the appliances through the door, and it's too cold for us to unscrew the door." So we'll have to come back anyways. So, which leads to the next conversation. We've talked a lot about the electric vehicles, the mandates for 2035, and it turns out the EVs are not working so well in Alberta and Saskatchewan right now.
Shock.
Well, it's
Sorry,
really interesting because we've been talking about this theme for a while, and how the conversation that we wanted to have was that it didn't make quite sense from a global perspective. So even if Canada like completely turned off the lights, we would have a little impact on the globe in terms of carbon emissions and stuff like that. But yet we're going very aggressive down that path. And now all of a sudden we get a 2-day or 3-day period with
that. It's cold, man.
It's cold, yeah, like extreme
Like a
cold.
week.
Okay, a week then. Now we're
Struggling.
whatever. It's been a few days, right? And
You guys are
but
such
now,
babies.
yeah, big baby. Like Rich is sick as a dog there, and he's not whining and complaining.
Well, in Quebec, we're used to it in Quebec. Anyway, keep going.
I know, like Steve there in Kitsilano, and he has some snow on and stuff like that.
That's horrible.
But it's really interesting because all of a sudden, out of nowhere, everyone across the country, if you're following the story, you realize that, oh wow, the contribution to the grid from wind and I guess to a little degree solar, it actually, I don't know, did it go to zero, Rich, or had very little impact? And then increasingly more people are turning on their heat pumps and whatever else they need to try to keep the place warm. So is it correct to say that the BC grid got overwhelmed and then they had to buy from Alberta, which overwhelmed their grid?
Other way around. So BC's grid's been totally fine. It's been, I think we've been sending some of the excess power over to Alberta. So their grid's been under stress. They've actually been encouraging people to kind of be conscious of, hey, don't run your washer dryer machine right now. It's, delay your, they're having to be extra conscious. They hit a all-time record high in terms of power usage on the grid. Set a new record for peak demand at 12,384 megawatts. Alberta has a wind fleet of 4,400 megawatts, and that was essentially emitting zero power during this entire time. And the solar was effectively non-existent as well. So they just had, as our conversation with Doomberg, unfortunately for Albertans, when it hit minus 40, the wind and the solar was essentially non-existent at a time when you needed it most. So didn't produce the reliability that many people would certainly appreciate. And so, yeah, I mean, this is coming full circle to the conversations we've had in this channel.
Hope is a bad strategy, to quote dear Keith Dicker. And I think a lot of this renewable energy stuff, that's what it is. You're hoping that in the coldest months in a very inhospitable climate, right? Just to quote Doomberg again, where he said, we're basically fighting against entropy, and that's what it is to live in northern climate. And unless you're going to do that with skill and technical ability, and have to do that also with the realization that, even some of these, by the way, these windmills, I didn't know this is actually kind of a cool fact. A lot of these windmills are actually heated. So, we can be critical of their sort of inability to work under extreme cold pressures, but they are heated. They are sort of rated for some cold pressures, but even that wasn't enough, which I thought was actually quite stark. And it's
a lot of mixed commentary. I was looking on Twitter. I'm just trying to find some unbiased sources, and I was kind of just scrolling through and reading a bunch of Twitter threads and people replying. I was trying to get some commentary on how people's heat pumps were working in minus 30, minus 40 conditions, and didn't seem overly positive. But
I don't know anything about that.
Technology's going to improve.
I don't know anything about that. I did notice that the other thing was interesting was that Danielle Smith, the Prime Minister of Alberta, her commentary from December was spot on, was quite prescient. I mean, in a sense, we're happy, in a sense, it could have been a lot worse. It's great that Alberta was able to sort of ask their neighbors for that power, and that more people weren't killed. We know in different jurisdictions, when you do have severe outages of power, that it costs lives. So I don't know, Steve. That was the other thing. I think no one's
Was
really
there a
about.
response from Ottawa? Because I know there was a lot of, I don't want to use the word noise, but there was a lot of strong views coming out of the West when this was happening. I didn't see anything from Ottawa as a response. Did you guys see anything?
Stephen Guilbeault was tweeting about the people's carbon rebates being sent out in the mail.
Oh, but wasn't there a CBC reporter that commented that the Tesla works the best in cold weather? Or
yeah, there was some ridiculous news article about.
I have it right in front of me. Can I read the headline?
You can read it. You can read it.
Go ahead.
Electric cars are the best vehicle in frigid temperatures, Saskatchewan advocates say. This is January 13th, 2024. And she goes, and then she says, it heats up faster than any gas car I've ever had. It's more reliable. I mean, this just, if that's
I can
let me chime in here.
I've got that car they're talking about. I mean, it's nice because you just pull out your phone and you can preheat your car. So like it's cool from that regard, but like the battery. So I can tell you, like, if I parked my car outside here and just went to bed, like it gets down to -10 at night, you'll wake up and your battery will be drained. You lose a good chunk of your battery, so you almost have to like keep it like plugged in, because when it gets cold, that battery just and I can't imagine leaving a Tesla parked on the street in -40 weather in Calgary. You'd probably wake up with almost no battery. So there's a lot of stories that were circulating around people having to charge multiple times throughout the day, because when they're leaving their car, parked in the parking lot, and then they come out from their lunch break to go somewhere else, their batteries like has been drained significantly. So they got to go back and recharge. So yeah, it's stupid article.
It works the other way as well, which I thought was really cool. I think it was another video that we were sharing about this gentleman. I think he was in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and it takes more energy to charge it up in the first place, which I didn't realize that was something new to me, where the resistance of the electricity that's coming through increases the lower the temperature, and so it takes way more energy from the grid to charge it up to like a regular 80 or whatever percent. And so I think he did the math that some 4 or 5 charging places were the equivalent of, I can't remember how many houses. You guys can find the video online, but I thought that was an interesting little factoid I didn't realize at all. So
the reality is, like, if you're in like rural Alberta or Saskatchewan, like having like a fully electric vehicle is an absolute nightmare. I mean, if you're living in Vancouver and it's a relatively mild climate, I think it's a great car personally, but
it's kind of like being a 40-something, 50-something year old gentleman with action figures. You're going to get mocked. If you're in rural Saskatchewan with one of these things, you're going to get picked last for the team.
Speaking of which, Rich, some big news. Alberta is now planning to build nuclear power plants to meet its long-term electrical demand. The first small modular reactors will be built by 2028. It's the completion date for an Ontario project the company's also involved in. So this is apparently coming. There's still a lot of things. They're partnering up with the Ontario Power Generation, OPG. So they've signed an agreement to jointly assess the development and deployment of grid-scale small modular reactors of nuclear energy for Alberta.
This is great news. This is great news, and it's also really good news for not just heating homes and charging electric vehicles.
So it says the construction of the first 4 SMRs in Ontario, so I guess they're going to Ontario first, will be completed by the end of 2028, and the unit will be online by the end of 2029.
Is that reasonable? So you're looking at like 5 years to get this online and contributing.
Yeah, they've been building nuclear power plants in South Korea in 3 to 4 years. I understand that the Koreans, they can do anything when it comes to these amazing projects. But yeah, you can build them relatively fast now. All of the delays, and Dr. Kiefer will tell us this. Maybe we should have him on again one day. But most of the delays in building a nuclear power plant are not the physical pouring cement and, tying up your little copper bows or whatever. It's the regulatory framework that delays these projects, not the physical building of them.
That's why I find it hard to believe in 5 years I have this up in. Well,
Yeah,
Steve, what
fair enough.
episode number will we be on at that time?
We'll
We should do
probably
an
be can-
over or under on whether
We'll
he's
probably be
spitting
canceled
it
by
out.
then.
Yeah, I'll probably be canceled. That's right.
Well, it kind of ties over into the World Economic Forum Davos
Oh boy.
conference.
Uh-oh,
what you
pull out
just
your
said.
hats.
I will
Gee.
definitely take an invite. If anybody from there is listening, I'll be happy to go to Davos. There's great skiing around there.
It's $250,000 for a ticket.
Exactly. I will take a free I will definitely go to Davos. It'd be great. Apparently there's like a rise in anyway, I don't want to get in trouble. There's lots of
What would be
unsavory
your
characters.
pickup line? Like, what would you say, right?
I would
need
tell
I mean,
them I
the
was
fact that you
starting
bought a
ESG.
ticket probably tells you you're rich enough.
Yeah, that's right. I tell them I'd start an ESG fund or something. I don't know. But anyway, we digress. There's lots of other
Okay.
stuff going on, so let's tap that.
So are we going to jump over to Switzerland now, or are we going to hang out with the CPI data? What's next on the list?
Yeah, we're gonna. Well, if you wanna get your comments in on the World Economic Forum, I'll let you digress. You got 2 minutes.
Look at you guys. One of these days, the light's going to come on inside and say, "What?" So every time, January every year they have the World Economic Forum, and if you notice, like everything is planned, so they have it on this week because this is the slowest data week of the year for U.S. data coming out. Right? There's nothing on. Yeah, there's literally nothing this week, except maybe one diffusion index, and that's about it. Which means it's still a pretty good week for Rich, right?
Yeah.
But I think everyone by now, they're familiar with the World Economic Forum and what they do and what they don't do. But two things caught my attention. First of all, they came out with their global risk report. Did you guys see that?
Yep.
Yeah. Yes and no. Okay. Anyway, so they always like to have them list as the number one risk for the world. And the number one risk this year for the world, it isn't an economic risk. It isn't debt, inflation, war, climate, terrorist attacks. Do you know what it is?
Disinformation.
I do.
Disinformation. Yeah. It's like Loonie Hour jokers, guys like us. But you think about it, like that is their number one risk that they have right now and on their list for the world. And so this movement, because we had, who did we have on here as a guest a while back when we had that new law that was being passed in Canada about?
Professor Geist.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
From the University of Ottawa, Professor Geist. From the University of Ottawa.
Correct. So everything is sort of linked together, but the World Economic Forum this year, because it's a huge election year, of course, especially for the Americans, and they are all over trying to control what data and messages and narratives are communicated. And so they're calling it misinformation and disinformation. And these guys, again, they have this ranked ahead of war, ahead of genocide, ahead of torture, ahead of climate. And we know how much they like to, but they know how much they love climate. I mean, we just talked about the Alberta experience.
Keith, on that list, what would be your biggest risk?
Well, I think you have to be reasonable. Let's put aside the war and genocide and torturing and that stuff. That should be the number one concern all the time. But just from a pure economic basis is the fact that if we do have an economic downturn and governments can no longer stimulate, because they're already stimulating, up to their ears now. Because think about it, you look at the deficits that are being run here in Canada. I mean, in Canada, are we still going to be 40 billion plus, like in that range? That's what was
but as a percentage of
estimated.
GDP, it's much lower. But anyway, I see what your point is.
Yeah, but it's still like an enormous number. The Americans around 1.3 trillion and so forth. And there's a lot of pressure, to try to get your fiscal house, under control. And if you try to do that at the exact moment in time when the economy is rolling over, it just accentuates the snowball. So for me, it would be on the whole debt economic side. But the other one, then, if you look at the geopolitical side, the real risk we have right now in the world, there's right now in the Middle East, guys, So what do you think, Steve? There's probably 4 or 5 or 6 fronts or wars taking place over there. Some are getting a lot of news, some are not getting a lot of news. For example, the Iran was just, I think they sent missiles over to Pakistan over the weekend.
Yep.
And I don't mean they didn't deliver them, like they fired them. That's where they went. But we have the potential, if something really escalates over there, oil can go from like $75 to 150 overnight. And as a central banker, what are you going to do then? Boy, it's going to be pretty hard to try to, you can jack up rates all you want and the price of oil will come down. What do you think, Steve? Like what would you have on top of your list?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think like the stuff that we've been talking about here for quite some time, which is dialing it back in for Canadians. I think in our narrow mind of what most Canadians are probably looking at is saying, okay, the cost of living. And I think there's a lot of Canadians that are crossing their fingers and hoping, and hope is obviously not a great strategy, but there's a lot of hope that the Bank of Canada is going to start cutting rates and that, interest rates are going to come down and people can, afford to carry their mortgages. We've talked about, over 60% of the mortgage holders in Canada have not seen a payment increase yet. And there's a lot more coming up here in 2024 and 2025 and 2026. These are all very large mortgage renewal years. And so, looking at the data this week, Canada's CPI still, it's sticky. Rich, I'm sure you got the numbers there. I mean, I know like we could talk about base year effects, and I think it was, part of the reason CPI came in higher on a year-over-year perspective was, the impact of declining gasoline prices has kind of fallen out. So we're not really getting that base effect to really help out with the headline number. But I think core inflation also came in stickier than expected. And so, as the Bank of Canada looking at this, I'm not convinced that there's a green light here to start cutting rates immediately.
I don't know, Steve. That sounds like some disinformation to me. You're trying to confuse people.
Yeah.
What really happened, Rich? What really happened with the numbers?
Well, I mean, just off the top, I think I agree with Steve. I think that is looking sticky, and I think it's going to keep them up a little bit at night. Headline. It's just like, I think it's important. We haven't gone over this in a while, so maybe it's worth it. We have the headline number is now, CPI. I'm looking at the wrong thing.
So Canada's CPI
Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong thing. Thank you.
Yeah, so it was up 3.4% in December from a year ago. That was following a 3.1% increase a month earlier. But the two key yearly measures that are tracked closely by the Bank of Canada, the trim and median core also increased, averaging 3.65%. That was revised upwards from last month. So, I mean, long story short is like, if you're looking at core inflation, which is what the Bank of Canada is kind of keeping a close eye on, it's actually accelerating. So that's and one, I think, Rich, I think it's like shelter inflation added a full point, 1 percentage point to CPI. And that's really a function of rent growth remaining elevated.
Which is reaccelerated, by the way. Remember, we had a couple of months where it was coming down, and then now it's back up again.
So the rental component is pushing that shelter component higher. And then you've got mortgage interest costs, which again are kind of self-inflicted by the Bank of Canada, but those remain at record highs. I think 28%.
Yeah, 29, growth. 20. Yeah, sorry, 28. Yeah. That's right. The thing that I wanted to add. Oh, sorry. Go
ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
The thing I wanted to add is like, we actually, there's a couple of measures that I think are worth noting, and they actually sort of bottomed. Not to make fun of Christina Freeland, but it's just sometimes you can't. You gotta hit the open net sometimes. It's funny because when she identified that the core inflation, so core means CPI, which is your total basket, excluding food and energy. Now you can argue about the wisdom of removing food and energy at different on a different podcast, but that's what they do. So we're removing food and energy. It bottomed in, I think, June at 2.8%. And we've actually, since that point, we've actually now are starting to make higher lows, so to speak. So we and so we got up to 4, then back down to 3.2, and now we're at 3.4. And so what you're seeing actually is this idea that 3 or 3.5 is sort of the new 2. Remember, for almost a decade, core inflation was basically 2%. Then we popped because of a bunch of stuff. I have
Say it, Rich. Say it.
because of COVID policies and stuff. So I have like PTSD from. Anyways, my point is that now the argument really was, is it transitory? Yes or no? We were on record of saying no, it wasn't. And this is sort of what we meant, which is you have the worries should be that we are now in a step function, one sort of notch higher. And the problem is if we stay there, and the recent data is starting to sort of pile up, is suggesting that we are. It's the same for the US, by the way, which we can maybe talk about some other time. But now we're sort of, is 3.5 the new 2? And so if inflation expectations are like that, if you have problems with rent and shelter, which are big components, if you get a fill up from energy prices, which right now it's not happening, but who knows, you have a situation where this idea that, and this is the idea that the Bank of Canada is going to cut interest rates by 50 basis points by June or whatever it is to bail out the housing market, very, very difficult to sort of wrap your head around that potential if we're at a situation where we're at 3.4. Remember, this is core and rising. So I think that's yeah.
Can I
Go ahead,
comment?
sorry.
There's an article today in the Globe and Mail, and the article headline says, "Think rate cuts are coming soon? Be prepared for disappointment," says CIBC's Benjamin Tal. So I click on this article. I'm like, wow, this guy's probably maybe thinking like us. There's no cuts. And so he says that, cutting in, March, April is going to be too soon. But basically, he sees the Bank of Canada starting to cut in the second half of the year by roughly 150 basis points in 2024. And I'm like, well, that seems
I
kind of
don't
like
think there are enough meetings available. But it was kind of interesting.
Well, that's what I was thinking. I was like, that's kind of a misleading headline, because I was like, that actually seemed like pretty aggressive. 150 basis points of cut this year.
Are they still sponsoring the Loonie Hour? Are they? Yes
we
or no?
love them. We want them to sponsor them. We love the Globe
they're
and Mail.
not
It's the
right
best
now.
newspaper ever.
You can do
Not
your
right
thing.
now, but maybe so. Sometimes mainstream media, that the headline of the article, they don't reconcile sometimes. But like something else, so have a think about this for a second. So the month of December was it's a pretty good month for a lot of financial markets. The US dollar sold off, but everything else went higher pretty aggressively, and it was what it was. Since then, we're 2 weeks now into the new year, and just to give you a view of what's happened with the expectation for the Bank of Canada. So at the end of December, markets, not what strategists or economists were forecasting, what markets were pricing, was that the Bank of Canada was going to cut by 150 basis points by 1 year out. So in December of 24. Now here we are, 18 days into, because this is Thursday, right? Everyone's listening on a Friday.
18 days.
Yeah. First joke of the year. Hey, how did that come?
It's great.
Was it flat?
It was a really good one.
Flat. It's kind of
it.
expected at this point. Yeah. But Steve has that beautiful smile. Hey, he still comes out. But back to the Bank of Canada. So 2 weeks ago, it was 150 basis points being expected or priced in. Now it's 100. So what in the name of God changed within an 18-day period to have expectations? And the same thing happened with the Fed as well. Even the Europeans are out this week, talking down expectation for rate cuts. So this goes back to the whole, hey, everyone was pretty excited to have 150 basis points of cuts because the mortgage would come down and stuff like that. And I think we commented that you don't want to see that happening. As if it is, it means something, there's a severe dislocation in the economy. So maybe now's not a bad thing. Maybe we do sort of, inflation stays in that 3.25% range. Not a lot of activity from the Bank of Canada. But I still continue to believe that the best outcome for our economy and markets is that, we had to struggle for a bit, but it's a very slow grind. and there's nothing dramatic happening. So I think what the CIBC article that was referenced, Steve, it seems to me like they're calling for maybe an unpleasant experience in the second half of the year.
Yeah, I don't know. I definitely appreciate a lot of Benjamin Tal's work. I think he's one of the better economists. But yeah, I mean, he's still got 150 basis points. So, we'll see. He gets.
But there's been on the U.S. front, just to wrap it up a little bit, just on the U.S. front, there's been some really positive consumer data, and some positive hard data. So there's something called the Dallas Fed weekly economic indicator, which includes a bunch of sort of daily, weekly stuff. It's tough to get macro daily stuff, but anyway, they aggregate a bunch of information, and that's starting to rise. The U.S. consumer is just not as bad as I would have said 6 months ago or a year ago. I got that really wrong. Despite the fact that you have increasing delinquency rates, interest rates are squeezing the housing sector. Used car prices are down because of all different reasons. So lots of different indicators are suggesting the U.S. consumer should be weak, and it's not. It's proving me and a bunch of other people wrong. And so that's also sort of the other side to that coin. You have the inflation component in Canada, which is maybe pushing up getting rid of the cuts here. But in the US, I would say it's more of the strong macro data that's doing the job.
Has that been the big?
With
ahead,
Bank
Keith.
of Canada, guys, yeah, we have 4 meetings in the second half of this year. That's it. There's only 4. So we have July, Sep, October, and December, and that's it. So
what's the first meeting of this year?
March, isn't it?
January 24th. Next week, guys. We have a Twinkie bet coming up. First Twinkie bet of the year.
People are excited. Place your bets.
We're going to do it now. 1, 2, 3. No cut.
No cut.
No, I mean, that's I'm gonna go no cut too. That's just
you guys waited for me to go first. That's pretty lame.
It'll get more exciting though as you get into March is the next one, Keith.
Yeah, March the 6th. That's not even then. It's kind of it's increasing a bit, but April is really when they're pricing in. No, I take that back, guys. Right now it's June when you get the first cut of 25 basis points.
But again, this keeps changing on a weekly basis.
It's changing by the hour. It's like Rich. I don't know what that means. What would that even be as a joke? I don't know.
Mean anything.
I know. It doesn't mean anything. Yeah.
A bunch of babbling turds over here.
Yeah, that's
I know. 3 of them. 3.5.
So, but has this been the most surprising thing so far? Is just the resiliency of the U.S. data or the U.S. economy? I just think there's been so many macro commentators on Twitter and Bloomberg, CNBC, there's definitely quite a few of them, I'd say, are really smart, respected individuals that have just been calling for the U.S. economy, sort of doom and gloom, recession, hard landing, and it just hasn't happened.
Yeah, I think what is happening is because there's been so much stimulus coming from the Treasury down in the U.S., with the deficits, and same thing up here in Canada as well. But of course, though, in Canada, we got the population growth story. That's helping keep aggregate data up. But I think though in the U.S., a lot of the rate hikes by the Fed has been offset by the fiscal stimulus, coming from the Treasury and Janet Yellen. So I think all these smart guys, they're going to be right. But I think things are just been delayed a little bit. But of course, this is an election year, so I can tell Treasury will not be becoming a bit tighter with the old wallet, so to speak. Traditionally, the central bank sort of steps aside. So with the Fed, unlike in Canada, we're talking about rate cuts in the second half of the year. The last opportunity maybe for the Fed. Do you have the Fed schedule there, Rich?
I do. Sorry. It is. Yeah, sorry. I think the first meeting is the end of Jan, then March, May, June, July, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's
meetings
so they're likely
January 1st. Sorry.
September 18th.
Yeah.
That's probably the last live meeting, for the Fed. And right now, markets are pricing in 100 basis points in cuts. if you can figure that out.
Mm.
And but the point is, the Canadians, we can cut in the second half. I don't know how we get 150 unless if we do get 150, it means, man, the shitter's full, right? Something broke in Canada. For the Americans have the opposite story because the Fed can't be seen to be helping the political side going in. And at the same time, the Treasury, they're absolutely going to be stimulating as much as they can to try to do the opposite of what the Fed is not trying to do. And then let's just say we get just say Trump wins in the fall. He kind of likes economic stimulus. So
Kind loves it.
So yeah, it's going to be, it's going to be flowing then in 25. And so then maybe, it kind of pushes everything out another little bit. But, we continue to live in this world of, economic and monetary extremes. And I don't see it ending, not for a while, which means like incredible volatility. So I think people know, like the S&P was down 20% in 22, 21 maybe. It was up 24 in 23. It's a hard way to make a living.
But Keith, as a macro guy yourself and as a portfolio manager, you probably enjoy the volatility, no?
Yeah.
I don't know if
just
maybe
from a pure interest. So I've been managing money for a while, and one of the most boring periods of my life was from like 03 to 08. I was out living on an island. It was 5 years. So back then, the American GDP was 5% plus. Like there was no risk anywhere. You literally just bought a bunch of stocks and stuff, and then went to the
Condos.
beach. Yeah. Then you just went to the beach and hung out. And that's not a bad way to make a living for a while. But then all of a sudden, you realize that during those great days, there was a few things building underneath, which was, these zero rates and variable rate mortgages and stuff like that.
But as a professional money manager, your job is ultimately to manage volatility, right? It's to manage like large drawdowns. And so, yeah, if you get this whipsaw in the S&P, I would imagine it separates the good managers from the bad managers, and it's just the ability to sort of manage risk for clients.
A professional manager should outperform on the downside, but then they'll get left behind on the upside. That's just the way it works. But I think there's so much risk out there right now, Steve, that there are some things that are pretty, like the oil story that we talked about there a few minutes ago. It doesn't mean it has to happen. But if it does happen, you better have stuff in your portfolio to protect you from it. Because if not, as an investor or anyone, you're going to say, what the heck? Everyone knew the Middle East could blow up. When else have you had 5 or 6 fronts happening at the same time?
Totally.
Yeah. So we have these things going on, taking place. What about you, Rich? So what do you see in that space?
Well, I just think there's two points I think are important to give people some context. Maybe they don't know, but there's been a huge sort of manufacturing resurgence in America, and I think that for all the criticism that Donald Trump got for the America First doctrine, I think it's really important that maybe some people don't know, but the Biden administration has effectively taken that strategy, that economic strategy, because that's what it is. It's not a political strategy; it's an economic strategy. And basically, put lipstick on it and a marketing team behind it, and the legislative force of the American it was a bipartisan bipartisan strategy to increase the manufacturing capacity and bring home a lot of that, back to America, and by extension, Mexico, by the way. So something we don't talk about enough on this podcast is emerging markets and sort of what's going on. Well, Mexico has been a major recipient of sort of that friendshoring, the manufacturing sort of gross fixed capital formation, which is the technical name for investment, sort of at the national income account level, has absolutely gone parabolic in Mexico. Remember, Mexico's economy is already very integrated into the U.S. economy, whether it's through rail for commodities or road for manufacturing and car manufacturing, all that stuff. And the same sort of things happened in the U.S. If you look at, I'm trying to pull it up here quickly, but if you look at sort of manufacturing gross fixed capital formation in the US. It was 120 billion. And now it's gone up to 109. So, you've almost had a 60% increase. So yeah, almost a 60% increase in the non-residential sort of CapEx for manufacturing structures in America. And that is basically one of the biggest year-on-year increases basically ever since basically when they started gearing up for World War II. We're not building tanks here, we're building manufacturing plants. So, a lot, unlike I think in Canada where a lot of deficit spending has been consumption based, which I will never support, a lot of that deficit spending in America has really been to support infrastructure and manufacturing. And I think that makes a huge difference. And so that's supportive growth, et cetera, et cetera.
So growth is still relatively sticky. Growth seems obviously a lot more resilient in the U.S., which we've talked about many times, particularly when you've got a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. Canada is still in this per capita recession. And so there's a lot of good data out this week. It's funny, we highlighted a tweet from you from 2019 on my Twitter account there.
2019. That's amazing, Rich. That's
yeah.
Really
so
cool.
It's funny because there was an article out, I think it was this week from all the mainstream media that was saying, the federal government was warned 2 years ago by their own policy staffers that immigration was going to overwhelm, housing and infrastructure, and they ignored it. And I says, well, they had 2 years. I mean, they could have followed Rich and they would have had a 4-year head start, but instead they chose to listen to nobody. And, we've been dealing with this. And so National Bank put out a really good report this week, which was kind of making its rounds, showing that Canada's housing supply deficit reached a new record of only one housing start. So one housing start for every 4.2 people entering the working age population. So it's one housing start for every 4.2 people entering the working age population. The lowest basically they've got on record. So it is a mess. And so it's interesting. We're going to see how this sort of plays out with interest rates, mortgages, sticky inflation, but it's certainly making the Bank of Canada's job much more difficult. And I would say is certainly supporting the housing market. Prices should have fallen considerably more.
It's funny because the focus has been on the supply side, build more units and things like that. And now you're starting to see more headline stories focus on the demand, looking at population growth. So one story this morning here I see on Bloomberg. Trudeau must stop the flow of asylum seekers, says Quebec leader, the premier of Quebec. It's like they're jumping up and down. And one of the solutions for Quebec is to send them buses so they can send the asylum seekers over to Ontario. And then you have the mayor of Toronto. I think she's also asking for buses so she can zip them, maybe over to Alberta. So it's a mess, guys. It's a real mess. And all of a sudden everyone is pointing fingers at each other. It's the university's fault, it's the Fed's fault, it's the provinces and so forth. But it doesn't matter whose fault it is. You need a solution, and the solution can't be treating the symptoms. Right? You need to make the dramatic, hard decisions. And I don't think anyone's willing to do it.
Well, I want to unpack that a little bit further because there was a
wait a second. The asylum seekers thing is a red herring, just so we're clear here. It's like a fraction of the total number. Anyway, sorry, keep going.
The so again, just to remind everybody, Sean Fraser is the Liberal MP. He's the housing minister. But a year ago, he was the immigration minister, and he was the immigration minister for quite a few years. And so he was interviewed this week. I don't know.
This sounds like the beginning of a joke or something, right?
Yeah, you can't script this stuff. But anyway, so he was, I guess, like, of course, the Liberal government's doing all these, photo ops and media spectacles around. Hey, we just helped get this, 13 housing units started in, rural Ontario, and the accelerator money is starting to kick in. So they're doing all these sort of conferences
And anyways, they did one with Sean Fraser. And then the reporter basically asked him, like, well, what's going on here with the immigration stuff? And he was like, yeah, immigration was basically, was running too hot. It was, people were manipulating and taking advantage of the system. And I was like, well, you were the guy that was running that system just, 18 months ago. And now you're in here trying to fix housing. But so we're coming back kind of full circle. But anyways, there was an article out this week from the Toronto Star, but saying that Ottawa may, quote, may limit international students in 3 provinces. This is per a CBC News article who was quoting a senior government source. That unnamed source specifically cited Ontario, British Columbia, and Nova Scotia. So the federal government is now looking, after all this backlash and finally figuring it out, 4 years too late, that they are going to consider limiting international students in those 3 provinces. So we'll see. But that's
what could go wrong with that strategy? Anyone? Bueller?
I'm curious about what you're going to say.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I've taken a bit of a deeper dive into the finances of universities. I just find it really interesting because they don't run a real P&L, profit and loss statement. However, the average university, their operating budget is subsidized anywhere from 35 to 60%, by the provincial government. And there's always this conversation about university's job is to educate people, is not to be a job factory and things like that. But yet you always have to operate within your budget. I mean, that's all you can do. And people who understand the finances behind university and the revenues, there's one revenue source primarily, I'm sure there's a few others in between, but it's you're looking at tuition, and then that tuition is broken under 3 kinds of students. You have the local in-province students. They pay the lowest tuition. Then you have out-of-province students, and let's just say their tuition is 50% higher, so 1.5 times higher. And then you have the international student, and their tuition can be, people can correct me, but depending on the school, it can be, 4 to 8 times higher than what the local kid is paying. So I know that universities have increasingly shifted their focus to trying to attract international students to come in because they need the money to try to get the budget to look at least a little bit better. And if the universities now in those 3 provinces have to stop the flow of international students come in, all of a sudden, their budgets get blown out, and then the provinces have to pick up the tab on it. And the provinces will then go back to Ottawa and say, hey, you got to help us with this because you created the channel to start with. So it's not an easy solution any way we look at it. But again, dramatic changes have to take place as long as we all agree and recognize that when if you're normally growing the country at, say, what, 400,000 is the average we're doing, 250 to 400 maybe.
Well, no, I mean, Canadian government, they set permanent residency targets. So how many permanent residents they want to basically bring in and approve. And that number, I believe, for this year is set at like 460,000 or 480,000. Anyways, it's supposed to get up next year, 2025. I believe it's supposed to hit 500,000. That's the target. And then they've said they're gonna sort of cap it at that 500K for the next.
But population growth over the last 2 to 3 years, it's been over 1 million. So it has been.
So I'll give you the data right now. So for 2023, as of right now, we only have the data for Q1 to Q3. So we don't have the Q4 data out just yet. But as it stands right now, we have added just a shade over 1 million people in the first 3 quarters. And of that percentage, 371,000 have been permanent residents. So we're kind of more or less on pace for that target of 160,000 or whatever. But the federal government doesn't set any targets for non-permanent residents, which is like international students and foreign workers. There's no target. So it's basically just like we don't set any targets. We just let whoever wants to come in can come in. And so we've added 654,000 non-permanent residents in the first
3/4 of this year.
And what were we back in, say, 18 and 19? I don't know the numbers.
Okay, yeah. So
the total, not like breaking it apart.
So this is from Mike Moffat, who's been doing some really good research on this. So from 2017 to 2022, the 3/4 average, because again, we're just going to use the 3/4 because we don't have Q4 yet. So the average between 2017 and 2022, we were averaging during that period, we had about 138,000 non-permanent residents in those first 3/4. And then between 1999 and 2016, we were averaging 54,000. So we went from like 54,000 non-permanent residents to 138,000. And this year we're at 654,000.
Yikes.
I don't know, Rich. How many?
I mean,
we're not using hindsight here. I mean, this is pretty simple stuff, that if you're going to increase the number of people in a market, economy, population, they have to eat, they have to live, they have to be educated, they need healthcare, they need to drive on roads, they need internet, you name it. And again, I just don't understand how this strategy change. I think it's a philosophical change, and I think it's been directed to us by another group that wears tinfoil hats and everything, but without having investment in these other capital investment areas that were needed, it's absolutely shocking and embarrassing that it has not happened, and not even a response for that. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think it's hard to argue against like, oh, they just made a mistake. At this point, it seems like, well, this was so obvious that it seems intentional at this point. I mean, I like to give them the benefit of the doubt and say it wasn't, but
I still think they're that smart.
Intentional is like when yeah, but like if a hockey referee makes a mistake and someone loses the game, okay, whatever. But I mean, this is a pretty significant mistake. I mean, you just drive down your city and you see people without homes. Like that's a pretty severe mistake to make. Kids not being educated properly, going from, you look at the ER wait times anywhere across the country. Again, it's not a good situation.
It's coming full circle, right, Rich, to your earlier point, which is you bring in all these people, there's nowhere for them to go, so they compete for rental housing because we can't build enough housing, and they drive up rents, so you create sticky CPI shelter inflation. You force interest rates higher, and the Bank of Canada can't cut rates because they can't get inflation back down to target. And so,
we were on this pretty early, and I think I'm happy we banged the drum. I think just a couple of quick things. No one is against immigration. That's dumb. Immigration is good. It's about having a plan. I disagree with Keith. I think in the sense that I don't think the mistake was the idea. The mistake is once the data is clear that you've made a mistake, not having the testicular fortitude to pivot and to adjust those numbers is really, to me, where the ideology gets in the way of doing what's right for your citizens and who you're paid to take care of. And it's the same. It's going to be the same bullshit with the electric vehicles and renewable energy shit. It's only when someone dies or people die or, a fleet of ambulances that are electric don't work to meet emergency needs. It's only when it is the whites of the eyes of the problems are like confound these politicians who are making decisions not on pragmatism, which is how basically everyone else lives their lives and makes decisions, but on dogma. And it's just not a good strategy. And I behoove the next fleet of prime ministers to take this as as a sort of advice, as caution that they don't do the same thing, because I don't think this is I don't think it's I don't think one particular side of the political spectrum owns this kind of stuff. But to not, once this was understood that there was something clearly wrong in the immigration system, this is 2 years ago, I'm sure we knew. And I'm sure, and this idea that, it's discreet, where someone raises their hand 2 years ago and says, "Hey, we've got a problem," and then no one says anything for 2 years, and then the CBC catches up to the Loonie Hour and says, "Hey, that's bullshit." People like Ben Rabideau have been outlining this for at least 18 months, explicit, detailed.
He
And we knew.
testified. He testified in.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he testified in House of Commons there. And yeah, like a couple years ago. And I know for a fact Christopher Freeland was on that call with him. And he said, like, he walked through the numbers, he pulled out his charts, and was like, I do research for a living, and like, this is, your population stuff is out of control, and just kind of got swept under the rug. And it's like, here we are finally, like a year and a half, 2 years later, we're like, there's so much media pressure and political pressure, and the polls aren't very good, that they're now actually like, oh yeah, oops, we might fix it with these potential solutions.
The mistake is not making political experiments. That's what all political parties, in a sense, do. Whether it's the guy from Argentina he's effectively at the beginning of a political experiment. He doesn't know how it's going to work out. He's confident. Some people see him. They may trust him. They think what he's doing is the right thing, but we don't know. And so it's when you have data, clear, obvious data, that your political experiment is going awry, the inability or unwillingness to change your mind is, to me, that is ultimately the most frustrating thing. That is ultimately the mistake. It's not the willingness to try new things or to say that Canada, we're going to do something different. It's when you're presented with glaringly obvious data, irrefutable data that you've effed up, to not be willing to change, to me, is, I would say, the more nefarious part of this whole process. Whether it's electric vehicles we're seeing in Alberta, whether it's the wind farms in this place, or whatever it is, it's just, I find that just very. I cannot forgive somebody for that.
I mean, it's a very good point that we're both making now. But I'd love to see how the sausage is made. So they get. Yeah, but you receive, I don't mean you guys, but as a government, you receive the information, you listen to everyone, and was a decision made to either that, hey, that the data from Ben, as an example, was wrong, incorrect, or is it we're going to get so many other benefits from this policy change that it will overwhelm that challenge that we could maybe have in 2 or 3 years? Do you know what I mean? Like, we don't know the answer, of course, but again, hindsight, it usually works out pretty well in a lot of different markets. But in the world, I call it demographics. Demographics, they're slow moving. You never really see the turn in anything. But when you have big numbers of people moving into a market or out of another market, it's going to have, it's pretty easy to know that, hey, there's a big change coming up. Okay, we need to be prepared for the change. And I mean, maybe it's fair or not fair to be, critiquing this, but in Canada right now, we have a pretty serious problem, because the problem that hasn't happened yet is that we do, and, like, oh yeah, boomers saying this again. If we hit a hard recession, boy, oh boy, it's going to really screw over a lot of people across the country. And it hasn't happened yet, but you're looking at the data out there, it is starting to roll over quite a bit.
I think for a lot of Canadians, though, it certainly feels recessionary.
Yeah.
I don't think this is by any means a strong economy. But to your point on the housing front and population stuff, you can kind of see the pressure it's putting on the market. So the national house price index, and again, I know you can't use a national house price because every market's a little bit differently. We're seeing Toronto sell off obviously a lot more than places like Calgary or Vancouver or whatever. But nationally, our house price index from the peak is down 12. I think it's 12%. 12 or 14%. So, a little bit of a price correction there. Rents over the last 2 years, though, are up 22%. From recent data from rentals.ca. That's amalgamated by Urban Nation, which is a very good research firm. So rents are up 22% across the country over the last 2 years. In terms of, bringing in 1 million people a year for the last couple of years, so 1 million people each year. the all-time record high for housing completions in a year is 270,000.
Is this housing units or housing like single family home? So I always
Units.
ask that.
Like,
Okay,
so it'd
cool.
be like one condo unit, like a 1 bedroom or a 2 bedroom condo, like that's one unit. And whether it's one townhouse or one, it's like we're just amalgamating all the new houses or doors that came onto the market. It's 270,000 is the all-time record high. And again, if you can do the math, if you're bringing in 100,000 or a million people a year, that's just not enough. I mean, so the household composition in Canada, which is basically says how many people live in your typical dwelling, it's 2.1. So whether that's a couple sharing a 1 bedroom condo or an older couple that's living in a single family house, 2.1 is your average household composition. I think that's actually up over the last number of years. So you can kind of run the numbers backwards and say, well, if we're averaging 2.1 people per house, how many households do we need if we bring in 1 million people a year? So the number is closer to 500,000. There's no way in hell you can ramp up housing starts or completions anywhere remotely close to 500,000. Like your record is 270,000. So maybe you through technology advancements and cheap capital and government incentives for financing, maybe you can get that up to 350,000. Maybe.
Right.
The other thing I'd like to note is, people often say, you look at household composition, and it's 2.1. If we actually had, like, let's say we had more abundant housing or cheaper house prices, do you think more people would go out on their own? Like I always look and say, how many millennials, for example, are living in like their parents' basement? It's not by choice.
Or
It's
having
because they don't-
kids.
Yeah, because they don't have an option because the housing is so unaffordable that you're getting more and more multi-generational housing. And so I always push back on people that say, well, it's not a supply issue. It's like the dumbest argument I've ever seen. Like, yeah, we know demand has been excessively created through immigration, cheap interest rates, loose credit, foreign money. But there's no question that underpinning all of this in the grand scheme of things is you still don't have enough housing.
You
Can I just
will
add one more
own
thing?
nothing. You will own nothing and you will be happy. That's where we're going, guys. That's exactly where we're going.
Okay, well, I'm gonna own something. Can I add one more thing? Just one more thing. Maybe. And Ben Rabideau, I think he articulated this better than I'm going to. So you can go find his tweet. But I think what we're doing inadvertently is creating we're stoking anti-immigration policy, and I find that the saddest part about this whole thing. Because, I think and I don't think that the Liberal Party realizes sort of what they're doing. And maybe this is a political statement and it's an economic show, and maybe we should move on. But what they're effectively doing is, because this problem is so acute and is so obvious from like where it's coming from and how long it's manifested and how it's manifesting, that you're basically stoking a generation of people who are not going to be as welcoming and are not going to be as open to the next wave of immigrants like my father and my mother, who come to this country because it's the best country in the world to try to make something for their kids. And I think that that's one of the saddest things that's coming out of all this. Instead of having a sensible policy that's flexible with housing supply, with ER times, with schools, with infrastructure, whatever, the dogma that's pushed this on is actually going to have a blowback. And that blowback, to me, which is, I'm really sad, you can already start to see it in the Twitter comments and CBC comment section, the blowback's coming. It's stoking this insular anti-immigration sentiment, which I think is ultimately going to be bad for Canada. And so that's I don't know, that's the part that makes me really sad. I had to share it.
Yeah. Keith, any final comments?
On that, or is the show over?
We're getting close.
We're getting close.
You paying
I have
attention
another
over there?
Yeah, I am. I have another World Economic Forum comment.
Man, you're all
Obviously.
over these guys. Are you
I
tuning in?
I'll allow
think-
it. I'll
Did you
allow
pay
it.
for the live stream?
No. I mean, I think we've had a really important conversation today about what has really triggered a lot of the stresses here in Canada. and again, I think everyone should be aware of that, and they should have more conversations with it, with people they know. From a higher picture level or view, I continue to follow this World Economic Forum narrative with a lot of interest. And again, there are just some really odd and weird things coming out of this group, and it is absolutely going to affect us. So the last one, which I'll just introduce the idea and we can talk about it another time, but Ursula von der Leyen, she's
that's
the
a tough one.
president of the European Council, the EU, president of the European Council, unelected, of course. She's been appointed. She's very important and a lot of power. But her whole opening speech in Davos was all about the World Digital ID system that's being modeled by the WHO, not the Stones, the WHO. And this is part of the World Health Organization pandemic agreement. This is what's being signed on to everyone. But she was just raving about this, and she specifically said, she said 51 countries across 4 continents adopted this for free, and it facilitated our ability to control mobility during health threats or any other threats we may have going forward. And remember last week, introduced the narrative that the Canadians, which would have been the current Liberal Party, they want to have climate risk introduced as one of the risks here with the WHO. So again, we're going down this personal ID road where if you don't get your central bank digital currency, they're going to try to do it another way. And I know some people smile at this; they go, that's a bit odd." But we are, guys, we're going down a very dangerous slope here, and this is something that you should be concerned about. And it's going to be one of these hindsight stories. So 5 years from now, when we're on episode 700 or whatever it is, we're going to look back and say, "Oh yeah, we talked about that, and now we're not allowed to talk about it anymore." But again, follow these narratives closely.
Speaking of that, Keith, I know you're a big pizza guy, and talking about digital ID registrations and stuff. Remember that story with it was the New York pizzerias that were like, they make pizza in these wood burning ovens.
Tell me about you're gonna make me upset. I know what you're talking about.
It's coal-fired ovens, because that's what you get a. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Wood?
Coal.
Okay, well, they were trying to shut them down in New York, right? And there was this huge.
Oh
uproar.
yeah.
So Montreal is now Rich is coming out with something proposal similar.
No, it wasn't Montreal. Keep going. It wasn't Montreal. Keep going.
Okay. Well, anyways, it's the Federal Environment Ministry, because I guess Montreal's been dragging their feet. Montreal area politicians have been stalling on the issue regarding forcing wood burning businesses to report emissions. So if you are, the Federal Environment Ministry is now looking into whether some restaurants and bakeries that cook food in wood-fired ovens should be reporting their total air pollution emissions to the National Pollutant Release Inventory each year. So they're looking to implement that. I just think, like, man, we've talked about it on the show, and like it's even who's out, like in the last week, it was former minister there, Bill Morneau, who's even said, "Hey, listen, Canada's got a productivity problem. We got to solve this. We got to figure it out. Our productivity stinks and we're falling behind." And I just thinking, I was like, man, as like a business owner, could you imagine just like, you're a busy guy, gal, and you're running this pizzeria, and you got to pick up the phone and you got to spend all this time reporting your wood burning air pollution to some large government bureaucracy? Like, how productive is that?
What about the bagel consumers? Essentially me, who want to eat proper freaking bagels. Listen, people don't understand. The only bagels in the world exist from two stores: St. Viator's, which is the best, and a close second is Fairmont. You can find those in the Plateau, Montreal. Those stores run 24 hours a day. They sell beautiful, delicious bagels, and not bread with holes in it. Bagels, and they're made with wood-fired ovens, and they've been doing that since the 50s or whatever. It started with some Jewish families from Eastern Europe. They came over after the war. They didn't know what to do, so they started selling these glorious, glorious bagels, the greatest things that have ever been made ever. And they need to be made with wood ovens. Now, people have tried to do it with gas ovens, which is also probably going to be banned soon enough, or with electric ovens, but it's not the same. There's a flavor profile. Keith knows what I'm talking about. Anyway, it's an outrage. It's insane. It's an outrage. We talked about how many coal-fired power plants China built last year, like 402 under construction. It's insane to me that they would ever threaten the single greatest food stuff ever known to man. And I was feeling pretty good this morning. Now I'm feeling very, very sad about this.
As if banning those Montreal bagel outlets is going to make any iota of a difference.
It's such a farce. Honestly,
so you're more outraged over a bagel versus your digital ID with your banking and everything on it?
Yeah, of course. I already have a digital passport. I have all of my information is online.
He's drinking the Kool-Aid.
It's not the same.
Every single
It's not the same. Not even close to being the same. Someone can hit the switch to prevent you from traveling, to prevent you from buying, prevent you from doing this or that.
I'm just saying.
Now, mind you, I do love a good bagel as well. I agree with you.
Could you imagine this guy goes?
It's all tied together. It's all tied together here. You just have
he goes to the
pick your
bagel
angle.
shop and his digital credit card doesn't work because it's that bagel's not environmentally friendly.
I feel like we're being punked. Like, there's like, how many cars are there in million? How many cars are there in Canada? The conservative, like 25 million cars, like I don't know if you guys know about like oil tankers or just tankers in general that, we're, for example, right now we didn't talk about the Middle East blowing up because the Houthi rebels are putting, the squeeze on the Red Sea, which is forcing bulkers, which is carry, commodities, container ships and oil tankers to take a lap around the Cape of Good Hope. I mean, burning marine diesel is like literally the worst thing you could possibly do for the environment. No one seems to care about that shit, but bagels, yes, you're right. I'm far more upset about bagels than I am about digital ID or even central bank digital currencies. Bagels are a source of life, Keith. And without bagels, you have nothing.
Keith, aren't you cook wood burning pizza at home? I thought you had like a fancy stove.
Not wood burning. No, I do have a gas fired outdoor pizza oven, and but in the pizza world, you want to get about 900 degrees Fahrenheit of heat, and there's only two ways to really do that. One is with coal, and the other one is with wood burning, and both of them produce a slightly different heat with a different flavor on it. And, food is beautiful, no matter, what culture you're from, what cuisine you're making or tasting or drinking. Everyone loves food. It brings everyone together, and you get a pretty strong reaction if you can't get your pizza or, whatever. And so there's lots of good points here today. So let us know in the comments how you feel about it.
Well, I'm glad I stirred the pot to end that one.
What do they, what they do? What did the Simpsons do? They like tied themselves to the tree to prevent the forest being bowled over. I'm going to tie myself to the St. Viator bagel. I'm going to go to
Do you guys remember the end? Remember the end of Men in Black?
Yeah, it's a great movie.
Yeah, remember the end? Like it zooms out from the city and Earth and the universe, and it is because you made a comment a few minutes ago. You said maybe we're being punked. Or pranked?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's what's happening. Maybe we're just a snow globe and someone has said, hey, let's do this to Rich in Montreal now. Time to shut it down, Steve. That's enough.
Shut it down. God bless you, Montreal bagler families. Bagler families?
Bagels. They're the best.
Yeah, they're good people.
I think it's babbling turds.
That's a good place to wrap it up. As always, appreciate your support, and we'll see you next week.